So where we left off, last week we talked about decimals, right? We talked about our different operations. We talked about how to add decimals, how to subtract them, how to multiply them, and how to divide them. We also talked about applications with decimals. So we've talked a lot about decimals, and the one thing that we want to start working on is we've talked about fractions in the past as well. And our goal is to not necessarily think of everything as totally separate. We want to see how they're similar to each other. And if you remember last week when we talked about decimals, before we learned how to add them, we looked at how we had to add fractions and how they were similar. So our goal today is to be able to look at fractions and convert them to decimals so we can become familiar with it. Because really, decimals and fractions are essentially the same thing. All they are different forms to write, right? I can call Joe Joe, or I can call him Joseph. We're still talking about the same person, right? So similarly with fractions and the decimals, it's just a different way to talk about that particular number, okay? So our goal today is to write fractions as decimals. So if I want to convert a fraction to a decimal, all I really have to think about is what does that fraction bar actually mean? So remember, we've had fractions that look like maybe 1/4. If I have the fraction 1/4, do you remember what this fraction bar really means to do? What operation does that really mean?
Divide.
Divide. So really, 1/4 is the exact same thing as 1 divided by 4. Well, don't we know how to divide things? Right, so all I really have to do in order to convert a fraction to a decimal, if I remember that the fraction bar just means the operation to divide, I really just have to divide. Since I'm having 1 divided by 4, that means 1's going to go inside of our house, and 4 is going to go on the outside of the house. Right, so really 4 is our divisor. Okay. Well, I'm going to think, does 4 go into 1? No. It's smaller than that, right? So what we do whenever we have that problem when we're dividing fractions, I'm going to put a decimal point next to my 1, because we know that's always implied to be there, and I'm going to follow it up with a 0. Because isn't 1 and 1.0 the same thing? So I'm allowed to do that. I haven't actually changed my number. So now, aren't I actually just dividing decimals? Right? We practiced this last week. We know we're going to bring our decimal point up, and then I can just really divide like regular. How many times does 4 go into 10? Twice. Okay. Do you guys want to do the long division or do you want to do short division?
Short.
Short? Okay, so Nicole wants to do short. So I'm going to add on another 0 there because again, 1 is the same thing as 1.00, so I haven't changed anything. So we said 4 goes into 10 twice, and how much is left over? That 8. 4 times 2 gives me 8, so I have 2 left over. Okay. And how many times does 4 go into 20?
5.
5 times. Okay. Is there anything left over?
No.
So I know I'm all finished. So we would call this a terminating decimal because it stops. Okay. So therefore, 1/4 is the same thing as 0.25, which is the same thing as 25/100. Right? So we're all done. Simple enough, right? So if we know what fractions mean, and if we know how to divide decimals, then we know how to divide, or how to convert fractions to decimals. Okay? So let's try, or I want you guys to try. I want you guys to try and convert 5/8. Like most of us are done, so let's go over this. So if I have 5/8, again, if I just think of what this is actually saying, we're just really saying we're doing 5 divided by 8. So I actually just have to do 5 divided by 8. So which number goes in the house, and which one is my divisor? Good, 5 goes in my house, right? That's what I'm splitting up, and I'm splitting it up into 8 pieces, so that's going to be my divisor. So 5 goes in our house, and 8 goes on the outside. And I'm going to think, does 8 go into 5? No, and that should make sense, right? Because we know we're going to have a decimal out as an answer, something smaller than 1, because we know the fraction 5/8 is less than 1. Okay? So let's say I'm going to put a 0, so I'm going to put my decimal point and add a 0. How many times does 8 go into 50 evenly? Good, 6 times. And you guys like short division, so we're going to stick with the short division. So if 8 goes into 56 times, how much is left over?
2.
Good. 2 is left over. So now I'm going to repeat the process. How many times does 8 go into 20?
2.
Twice. And now what's going to be left over?
4.
Good. 4. And how many times does 8 go into 40?
5.
Good. 5 times. And what's left over?
Nothing.
Nothing. So I'm all finished. Okay? But if I just wrote this as an answer, we wouldn't be correct. Jenna, what would be wrong with this?
There's no decimal.
Good, there's no decimal point, right? So we divided, but we didn't divide it perfectly correct. So where does my decimal point go? Does it go before my 6, between my 6 and my 2, between my 2 and my 5, or after my 5? Good, we're going to put it up right before the 6, because remember, when we divide, we just bring up our decimal point. Right. What questions do we have? Raise your hand if you got that right. Brilliant. I love it. Love it. All right. So those are just dividing regular fractions, okay? And what we might want to notice was, wasn't this fraction smaller than 1? Right? So wasn't my decimal equivalent smaller than 1 as well? Right, so it should make sense. Notice, isn't this a proper fraction? So proper fractions are going to have decimals that are equivalent to something less than 1, because a proper fraction is less than 1. Well, what do you think would be different if we had an improper fraction? So for instance, if we had 18 tenths. Well, if we want to convert 18 tenths, let's think a little bit. Is this number bigger or smaller than 1? Bigger, right? Because it's improper, right? The numerator is bigger than the denominator. So we know our decimal equivalent is going to be something bigger than 1. But am I still going to change my process at all? No, I'm still going to do the same thing. It doesn't matter whether it's proper and improper fraction. When we convert fractions to decimals, we really just have to divide. So I'm going to put 18 inside of my house and 10 on the outside. Okay? Well, 10 goes into 18 one time. I'm going to add some zeros here. Okay? How many times, or how much is left over when I take 10 into 18? 8. 8's going to be left over. Okay. And how many times does 10 go into 80?
8.
8 times. Is anything left over?
No.
Nope. Again, we're almost correct, but we're not perfectly correct. What are we missing? Decimal point. And Shannon, where does it go?
Between 1 and 8.
Perfect, thank you. So I really get 1.8. And again, does that make a little bit of sense? Right? Because we know this was bigger than 1, right? 18 is almost twice 10, so we know this number is pretty close to 2, and 1.8 is pretty close to 2. So converting proper fractions or improper fractions to decimals is really the same technique. Okay? Well, what about if we wanted to do mixed numbers? Well, let's think about that. So let's try doing 4 and 3/5. So let's say I wanted to convert 4 and 3/5. Well, when I look at this, is this number bigger or smaller than 1? Bigger than 1. Okay? So I'm going to have a whole number portion to it. What's my whole number portion going to be? 4, right? Because if this is 4 and 3/5, when I write this as a decimal, it's still going to be 4 point something. So really, don't I just have to convert this 3/5 portion? Right? So when I convert a mixed number, again, it's really not much different. We keep the whole number part the same, and then we're just going to convert the fraction to give us our decimal. Okay? So really, we're just going to take 5 into 3. Well, we know that's going to be smaller than 1. 5 doesn't go into 3. So I'm going to place in my decimal point and a 0, because 3 is the same thing as 3.0. How many times does 5 go into 30, Antoinette?
6.
Good, 6 times. And what's left over?
No.
Absolutely nothing. So really, 3/5 is the same thing as 0.6, or we can also read that as 6/10. Okay? So I've converted my fractional part to a decimal, but have I converted my mixed number to a decimal yet? No. Joe, so what should I write?
4.6.
Perfect, so I should write 4.6, right? The mixed number, the whole number of my mixed number, is still going to be the whole number in my decimal equivalent. And the fractional part, the 3/5, is 0.6. So 4 3/5 is the same thing as 0.6. Okay. So what questions do we have? Don't we love converting decimals?
Yes.
Right? Right? It's pretty straightforward. If we know how to divide, we're all set. Okay? Yes.
Can you convert it back into an improper fraction and still get the same answer?
I can, right? So our other option is, so we went straight from the mixed number to this. But Antoinette's asking, well, could we convert this to an improper fraction and then convert? Yeah, absolutely. It might take a couple of extra steps. It's not the most efficient method, but it'll work. So you can do that as well. What other questions do we have? Nothing? Okay, so then I want you guys to try a couple on your own. I'm going to give you bigger numbers to try though. So I want you to try things like 28/65. And I'm going to have you do 9/10. So I need you to try to convert 28/65 and 9/10 on your own.